His Majesty herself. That's how one ancient Egyptian pharaoh presented themselves. She was born a woman named Hatshepsut, who took on the form of a man while sitting on the throne. The artifacts we found of her in a womanly form while wearing a beard shocked archaeologists. Is she one of the first examples of someone who defied gender norms in ancient history? I'll talk to Dr. Debbie Challis from the London School of Economics and Political Science. So let's dive right in. A Smithsonian article labels Hatshepsut as the queen who would become king. She was a female who presented herself as a male on the throne. Can you tell us why?
Well, it's interesting because that article, there's actually a book by that name by Cara Cooney, and she essentially took the male attributes to the throne. She wasn't the only one to do this. There have been other female rulers, but nobody sort of took the beard and took a lot of the male trappings to be a pharaoh of ancient Egypt in the same way that Hatshepsut did. Essentially, the main reason she did was 3,500 years ago. She basically, there was a vacuum of power. She was married to Tutmosis II. She was stepmother to the pharaoh that became Tutmosis III, but he was a very young boy. So she essentially stepped in, but she didn't just become regent, as sometimes happened. She actually became pharaoh in her own right. So to establish herself as pharaoh, she needed a cartouche. She needed essentially what was seen as the kind of power symbols that go with being a pharaoh. So that seems to be the main reason that we can guess that she did that.
She was, and from my understanding, just about the second at that time documented female pharaoh that we know about. And was it more an idea of her assuming this male role on the throne because she wouldn't be taken seriously as a female?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we're kind of guessing, as we always do, because what she's left behind is what she wants us to see, which will be about power. We don't know of many others. So there was Queen Menif in Dynasty in 1, right, 1,000 years earlier. There were a few others, but she's, yeah, and of course you then get the Cleopatra's almost 1,500 years after that. It seems to be because she had complete control rather than doing it with somebody else, although she supposedly did rule with her stepson for a bit. So I think she was basically trying to to fill this hole that was at the center of this dynasty, and to make sure that she had the power. I mean, she ruled for 24 years, which is quite a long time for any pharaoh, frankly, let alone a female pharaoh.
It's super interesting the point you made that from her until 1,500 years later, we don't have someone or a figure like Cleopatra, just to show how the rarity of a female stepping onto the throne in ancient Egypt. So how do we know about her gender fluidity these thousands of years later? What do the artifacts show us that show that she was very gender fluid when it came to ruling Egypt?
Like all societies, there's different ways of expressing masculinity and femininity, and biological gender. I would argue that the two are separate. So you have cultural forms of gender, socio-cultural, if you like, and then you have obviously biological gender, of which there's more than two. So she essentially took on the attributes of masculine or socio-masculine kind of forms of gender. So she's depicted wearing a false beard. She, on the statue in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, she's bare-chested and she wears the kilt of the male ruler, but she has a female form. So she's not completely like male, if that makes sense. So she has breasts in some of her depictions. And then she uses a male name. She uses, for one of it's I'm probably not pronouncing this right, Mathara, which is basically a name as to a masculine name. And yet she uses feminized versions of kind of things like Pharaoh and things around her. So she's not pretending to be male, she's not completely doing that. She's using some sort of masculine forms for her own power and for her own depiction.
So she is just totally blending the idea of the masculine and the feminine. Like you said, in these artifacts, she is presenting in a female form, but she has a beard, or she's been tested, or she's wearing this male kilt. How shocking was it for these Egyptologists to find these artifacts with Hatshepsut, a woman, also blending in the masculine.
I mean, I think it's more shocking for the Egyptologists than the Egyptians. And I think that's the trouble with how we've read it and read back. I mean, that's the thing about doing ancient history, and that's really my specialism, is looking at how we read back from ancient history. So it's very hard to not apply our own values and belief systems onto people and societies from the ancient world. And I mean, there was a campaign after she died to sort of remove her signature and her cartouche, and she built this amazing site, Dear Old Bahira, and there was this kind of attempts by St Moses III, but quite some time into his reign to get rid of her image. He ruled for about 8 to 10 years before he did anything about it, which suggests that it was more to do with establishing his own dynasty afterwards, to sort of get rid of hers, because she wasn't, strictly speaking, a direct line descendant, whereas he was, and he at this point had descendants. So he was obviously trying to establish his own dynasty. So it was shocking for Egyptologists. I mean, Champollion, who I think first translated her cartouche, had just assumed she would be the wife of a king, didn't quite know how to translate this cartouche. So, and this was in the, 200 years ago, in the early 19th century, when he's first kind of really translating hieroglyphs, but based on the Rosetta Stone, of course. And he's looking at all these different cartouches from history. But even though the Egyptian historian Manetho, again, I've probably pronounced that badly, but there is record of a woman being on the throne.
There's an inscription in her tomb that translates to, and I have the note here, His Majesty herself, or the king herself. How does that discovery of Hatshepsut really redefine the way we think about gender and sex in ancient Egypt, and how it reflects on our society today?
But it's a really interesting, I love that, His Majesty herself. I mean, that's exactly captures how she used both pronouns in ancient Egyptian, which is like our language, a very binary driven kind of language. There's a really interesting article actually that I went to reference, and I'm going to probably pronounce the name wrong, Ross Mattock, I think, but they have written a book, an article called Dequeering Hatshepsut, and that they talk about the binary, the sort of the bind of the binary in how we look at ancient societies. And I think it's really useful here to think about, because more recent scholarship, and more, I would argue, progressive scholarship has looked at Hatshepsut and some other examples from ancient Egypt and other societies, and really looked at how we just tend to apply our heteronormative, that is, assumptions about different sexes being in different couples, and our binary senses of male and female onto societies that didn't necessarily have those norms, didn't have necessarily follow the binaries that we follow in Western sort of society over the last 500 years, if you like. So I think it's really that sort of the use of pronouns there is really interesting, to basically explore the idea of this binary bind that we get ourselves into. I mean, I kind of bang on about this a bit, because I have a thing about how we depict families, particularly from the ancient world, because this idea of the nuclear family is actually not particularly truthful representation of families in the modern world, even over the last 100, 200 years. It's very much an idea that has been implanted on us in the 1950s, particularly, and it certainly wasn't the case in the Roman world or the Greek world that's how families were. So adoption, extended families living together, 2 wives, that kind of thing. That's very much what an ancient family might have. This idea that we look at the past and we assume that families, units, or relationships for the same binaries that we don't actually follow, let's be honest, but society expects us to follow today as the norm, is very problematic. And actually, to try and think outside of this kind of heteronormative box and this sort of binary gendered box requires quite a lot of thoughts before you do so, but the evidence is there if you look at it.
Do we know if Hatshepsut was the only non-binary, gender bending or gender fluid pharaoh in ancient Egypt?
Well, no, she wasn't the only. I mean, the more famous one, I would argue, because I think Hatshepsut is still seen as like a woman who just who pretended to be a man,
Yeah.
rather than gender bending, and I think that's still how she's seen, and that's partly because of 70s feminism and second wave feminism and things. But I think Akhenaten, who is in the same kind of dynasty as her. And it's kind of interesting, as a New Kingdom, there's a lot. It's the most famous period of ancient Egypt. It's 2,000 years after the pyramids. But it's the period we know probably most because of Tutankhamun, and a lot of the discoveries of excavations of ancient Egypt, particularly in the early 20th century, were of New Kingdom sites. So obviously the other one would be Akhenaten, who had his own site at Amarna. And was again depicted more biologically androgynous, and there's been lots of reasons. Scholars have given lots of reasons as to why that may be. He may have had a medical condition, he may have had all these things, or he may have just been gender binary. And certainly to have the role of the pharaoh, you had to have some aspects of both genders to recreate the world anew. So that's another thing that's come out in more modern scholarship about this idea of often wives of the pharaohs would be reborn, so they could impregnate, through a male role, the world, like like Osiris and Isis. So they took on different roles. So it's not quite as clear cut as you think, but certainly I would say Akhenaten is probably more famous for that.
How was Akhenaten depicting themselves when it came to, like, what was the difference between the relics you would find of someone like Hatshepsut and someone like Akhenaten?
Well, Akhenaten, I mean, he came up with his own whole, a whole kind of what's the word? Sort of religion, essentially. So he sort of shifted. It was already happening before him, so it wasn't perhaps the great religious revolution that we tend to read into it, but he essentially came up with almost a monotheistic religion based around the worship of the sun, and in that he played different roles. He and his queen, she wasn't a co-ruler, but certainly his wife, one of his wives, Nefertiti, would have different gender aspects. So he was, for example, he wasn't seen in the kind of the typical Egyptian male form. He had breasts. His face was quite androgynous. He didn't always wear the beard, for example. And then he and Nefertiti were often dressed very similarly, so you couldn't always tell them apart from their crowns. So there's a kind of, it's not quite gender fluid, but it's getting that way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, you see figures like Hatshepsut and Akhenaten crafting a new image, sometimes taking on a new name, basically redefining their identity. And all this are struggles that people we see today in the non-binary and in the trans population have to go through at one point or another. And it's particularly striking to me, those parallels, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, when I worked at the Petrie Museum of Egyptian Archaeology, it was quite a few years ago now, there was an opera on Akhenaten that was, I don't know if you know the Philip Glass opera, but it's just called Akhenaten. Very simple. There was an opera at the English National Opera House, and they were doing, I mean, it hadn't been performed in this country since the 70s, I don't think. So it was quite a big event, and E&O partnered with UCL, and we were cultural partners. So essentially we put on an exhibition around Akhenaten. Flinders Petrie, who's the archaeologist who was one of the founders of the museum, worked at the big site, Amarna, and excavated quite a lot of, sort of the artistry and various little statues of Akhenaten. So we put on, one of the events that we put on for LGBT plus History Month, which in the UK is in February, was on Hatshepsut and Akhenaten, about looking at their gender and I hesitate to apply trans and non-binary. Perhaps non-binary I would apply actually, but only because I don't think the binary historically as we see it existed. But we went to Trans London and for mainly just to get advice on the terminology to use, but we also advertised the events to members, some of whom came along on the night, and we sort of partnered with an institute in Exeter that investigates sexology and how terms around sex and gender and sexuality were kind of born from the late 19th century through to now, and how they, even in the sort of the last 120 years, they've shifted meaning hugely. So yeah, I mean, and Akhenaten's certainly seen as a role model, if you like, and so is Hatshepsut, I would argue. Petrie exhibited at both, temples around Akhenaten and Hatshepsut, and so we did have quite a lot of the cartouches, with her, his name, of the Pharaoh. So we had that evidence, and it's really interesting because how the reaction to those names, I mean, it basically, it reflects what's going on in kind of attitudes to sexuality at the time. So I mean, Joyce Tildersley argues that when Petrie's excavating, and perhaps before then, that there's not so much of a problem with the idea of a female ruler because of Queen Victoria, everybody's used to Queen Victoria. So there's this sense that, that's, a woman on the throne, but she doesn't have much power. They go on about there being no wars, kind of completely forgetting that she goes to Punt and has a massive war, and is a military ruler just as much as any other pharaoh. And then you get this backlash in the 1950s that kind of see her as a sort of this, and again, this is reflecting the kind of sexology of the time, about this pantomime of changing her sex, and about this pathological drive to actual male impersonation. So things like male impersonation are being used rather than, this idea that a woman's being something she shouldn't be. Yeah. And again, it's like this kind of digging down on the binary, which we know happened in the 40s and 50s very much, in terms of, I think it's almost a reaction, because they're a bit like now, sometimes you get a reaction just as things are like changing. They know that the change is happening, so there's this reaction against it, which makes it very repressive for 10 to 20 years. But actually then ultimately you can't hold it back, because people don't behave in a binary or heterosexual way all the time. Do you know what I mean? So that's what happens. So you get this reaction against it, and I think it's really interesting, because although I'm loath to apply sort of terms that we might use to describe LGBTQ people today, I definitely would apply non-binary, just because I just don't think our binary is the same.
The point is, the struggle is still very real for female politicians and business leaders in today's modern society. Things really haven't changed in thousands and thousands of years, and that's kind of scary to think about. Well, what can this female king teach us about identity politics today?
Well, actually, that's very interesting. Yeah, what can that's so depressing, you just saying that. Sorry, I'm gonna stop. It really is. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it is so hard for women to rule, and I think part of it is to do with power. And there's a really interesting book, I'm looking at my bookshelf to see if I can see it and pull it off. Yes, here we are, by Mary Beard, the classicist Mary Beard. You've probably heard of her, but yeah. Mary Beard, Women and Power, I totally recommend it. It's essentially 2 long essays, one of which was a lecture she gave at the British Museum, which looked at how women in power have been portrayed, particularly in the classical world, and and how some of those kind of ideas about them being a monster or Medusa apply today, if you see what I mean. So she sort of looks at how the language of the past, the misogynist past, that we tend to think, oh, it's misogynist, of course ancient Greece was misogynist. Well, still being used today to basically, again, about people like Hillary Clinton, Angela Merkel and Germany. So it doesn't go away. How can we address it? Well, it's such a hard question, isn't it? I wish I knew, because if I did, we'd probably have a female prime minister in Britain that wasn't pilloried because she didn't have children, which is what happened to Theresa May when she was starting to get elected. And and the double standards of behavior from men and women in power. I mean, personally, I don't feel that what politicians do sexually should affect how they are. But if they're behaving in an immoral way, like by illegally paying money or that kind of stuff, and that's a different thing because that breaks the law. But if a woman behaved like some of the male politicians behave, that would be, unacceptable, and they would get a lot of abuse for that. So, and probably not be elected for that, because of those things. So it's the double standards, and that's what we still have, and that's the difficulty, I think.
Bringing us back to what we've been talking about, do you think it's safe for people today to look at Hatshepsut and look at Akhenaten and say that they're probably the first non-binary people in Egyptian society that we can look to and claim as part of, the sort of LGBTQ umbrella?
I think there's some of the first we can look to that we know about today. I think it's interesting because I think around both the representation and the cartouches and the language around them, from ancient Egyptian language around them, obviously shows that the binary wasn't quite the same as we think it was. And I think, to me, that says, we are stuck in this binary bind of seeing, of applying our own assumptions about what male and female is and how people were to the ancient past. Having said all that, I think, I think for LGBTQ people today, they can look at that and you can say, well, that wasn't, actually people didn't always live like we live today, or in the last 50 years, or even the last 100 years. People have always lived differently. And certainly, but part of my interest in classics when I was, 17, 18, was partly because I had this dawning realization that actually society was really different, like in terms of about, there's lots of bad things like slaves and stuff like that, but we had those here until relatively recently, let's be honest. But actually, in terms of sexuality wise, it was different, and that actually what I'd kind of been taught for years wasn't the case in Greece and Rome. And that's part of my interest, if I'm honest, in kind of the reception of the ancient world, is it is different, and we tend to apply similarity rather than acknowledge the difference. And that's true when it comes to race, that's true when it comes to sexuality, that's true, to so many aspects of looking at the ancient world from the modern.
Doctor, thank you so much for doing this. I loved having you on.
Oh, no, that's okay. Thank you.